How's everybody doing? Are you awake? Good morning. It's a little intimidating, I think, as you say here, now for something completely different. We're going to talk about space power for a minute. But I feel like I owe you a little bit of credibility up front. I did spend 28 years in the U.S. Air Force, where I, too, was subjected to overly profane fighter pilots. In the Air Force, we called that mentoring. Some of my mentors are in the room. Self-identify later if you wish. My 28 years culminated in helping manage the air war in the Middle East as the deputy CFAC at Qatar, which is an interesting thing when you depart the country for a year, and at about the 6-month point, you understand that the Department of Defense back home has reorganized you out of a job and stood up a new service in your absence. It's quite interesting to get that phone call and say, hey, did you hear about the Space Force? And you're trying to learn on the fly what that means for a space guy running an air war in Qatar. And it was quite a dynamic period. So I'll offer some comments later on that maybe, but it's a real honor to be here amongst the Air and Space Chiefs. And I'm honored to be on the stage. Thank you, Susanna, for that introduction. And to my service chiefs, compatriots, Sir Rich and Chippa, it's really an honor to be here and talk to this audience. I thought what I'd do is take my time allotment and discuss first how I see the current space security environment. Next, how we in the United States are orienting to that challenge with the Space Force's theory of success. And finally, how I think we collectively, the U.S. and our allies and partners, can work towards a future where space is safe, secure, stable, and sustainable in ways that ensure peace and prosperity for all spacefaring nations. Now first, as this group knows well, warfighting in this modern era is evolving rapidly. It is increasingly all-domain, integrated, global, and executed now at the speed of light. It also extends into the space domain, as we've seen at the onset of Russia's unprovoked war against Ukraine. It is a space domain that is radically different than when I joined the U.S. Air Force. And honestly, it's radically different than even just 3 years ago when the U.S. established the Space Force. The space domain is now an environment where launches send up an average of 14 satellites per rocket, instead of 4 per launch on average in 2019. Now that statistic must be viewed in context. As each launch has more than 3 times the impact on orbiting spacecraft, we must also recognize that the total number of annual U.S. launches has more than doubled in the same time period. Additionally, an increasing number of new governmental and commercial entities are entering the launch business seemingly every day. This has reduced the cost to orbit to fractions of what it was a mere decade ago, with forecasts showing that the trend may continue until we're looking at costs on the order of hundreds of dollars per kilogram to orbit, down from tens of thousands of dollars. Now, this creates tremendous opportunities for new missions and architectures in space, but it has also contributed to a dramatic rise of the total objects now tracked in orbit, just over 44,800 as of this month, compared to around 25,000 in 2019. It is not just an increased use of the domain, we are also seeing an incredibly sophisticated array of capabilities now threatening the domain as well. This includes cyber attacks, persistent satellite communications and GPS jamming that we've seen used in the conflict in Ukraine, and even more destabilizing direct descent anti-satellite weapons across multiple orbital regimes, on-orbit grapplers, pursuit satellites, projectiles fired from on-orbit motherships, and directed energy weapons that await use for future conflicts. It's not just threats against our on-orbit systems, it's the use of space by our competitors threatening our forces in the other domains that has come into sharp focus in the last couple of years. These space-enabled targeting capabilities fielded by potential adversaries dramatically increase weapons range and accuracy and threaten military operations on land, sea, and air. Collectively, these fundamental changes in the security environment have led to what I believe is a new era in space. And a new era requires a new evaluation of how we've oriented to respond to risks and threats. In this effort, the U.S. Space Force started by proposing a working theory of success that I've entitled competitive endurance. A theory of success, not victory, because it seeks to ensure our adversaries are never desperate enough or emboldened enough to pursue combat operations in space. This means space forces must have the ability to endure by sustaining a perpetual state of competition in space as the preferable condition rather than crisis or conflict. The goal of this theory of success is to ensure our joint and combined forces can achieve a degree of space superiority when necessary, while also maintaining the safety, stability, security, and long-term sustainability of the domain. Now, most importantly for this audience, I believe the theory's viability rests on our ability to build a coalition to uphold and strengthen a rules-based international order for space. Now, let me offer a bit more detail on this theory of success. As I've outlined it, competitive endurance has 3 tenets. Tenet 1 is to avoid operational surprise. Avoiding operational surprise requires comprehensive and actionable space domain awareness, what we know by its proper military acronym, SDA. We must understand what's happening in space to ensure safe operations, while simultaneously monitoring for behaviors that are irresponsible or even hostile. Now, this audience will immediately understand when I use terms like safety of flight or conducting a safe intercept. Yet these concepts, even when properly defined for space, cannot be implemented without effective space domain awareness. And by the way, because space is global in nature, SDA must be a collective effort. A shared understanding of the domain enables the coalition to have actionable, cooperative decision-making. It helps promote responsible behaviors and enables appropriate responses that avoid unnecessary escalation when confronted with malign, irresponsible, or even dangerous actions. And you'll notice I said the coalition in my description here. I firmly believe that we must normalize how we collectively operate in this domain. That means building a coalition space domain awareness framework. We need to continue the shared strength of interoperability that we see in other domains. This leads me to tenet number 2, which I've called denying first mover advantage. Now, as those of us in the profession of arms well know, the history of warfare includes evolutions in weaponry, fortifications, and tactics that periodically have shifted advantages from offense to defense and back to the offense cyclically. Currently, the visibility, predictability, and reconstitution timelines associated with today's military space architectures favors offensive action over the defense, a condition that we describe as first mover advantage. This is an unstable condition that works against deterring attacks in space. We can't have that. Therefore, we must shift this balance by making an attack on satellites impractical and self-defeating, thus discouraging an adversary from taking such actions in the first place. One way to do this is by investing in a resilient space order of battle. This is one reason the U.S. seeks to continue to develop opportunities to disaggregate and diversify missions conducted in space. We have great partnerships, we have great partnerships executing that model today, like our satellite communications partnerships and rideshare programs with Norway and Japan. And I want to expand those partnerships. We also have started conversations with our partners about an integrated force design. I'm working hard to lower the classification of this effort so we can share lessons learned and help involve partners more effectively from the outstart. The final tenet of competitive endurance calls for space forces to prepare to achieve space superiority via what I call responsible counterspace campaigning. There are several elements of this. First, the Space Force must continue to implement the U.S. Secretary of Defense's tenets of responsible behavior. We must encourage like-minded nations to support these tenets and join us in confronting nations that choose to act in irresponsible ways in space. Next, we must normalize how space operations are baked into joint and coalition planning. If you pardon the analogy, we want to add space as an ingredient to the cake before it's baked and not as frosting added after the fact. Here, I'm also happy to report that there are great examples already, including the NATO Space Center at Ramstein, the Space Operations Center in Australia, Canada, United Kingdom, the NATO Space Center of Excellence in Toulouse. Additionally, other nations are establishing cadres of space professionals and dedicated Space Operations Center, like the Polish Space Operations Center and the Japanese Self-Defense Forces Space Operations Center. I'll stop there, but there are many more. I do think I'm being fair when I say that all our efforts, including the U.S. Space Forces, are still nascent in this regard. We still have much to do to normalize space operations, tactics, techniques, procedures, and standards, just as we have done in the other domains. And when I say there's value in alliances having a common set of standards, I know folks in this room know what I'm talking about. And certainly the situation in Ukraine has demonstrated the critical importance of timely coordination among allies. Now, as we've learned before, mutual understanding, interoperable equipment, common communications, network infrastructure, these are the building blocks of successful multinational operations. If we ignore these lessons in space, space will be disconnected from the greater effort and operational effectiveness will suffer. To implement these lessons in space, we must collectively build TTPs, just as we've done in every other domain. We must collectively train like we fight, as we've done in every other domain. And we must collectively operate together as a coalition, just as we've done in every other domain. The bottom line is that international cooperation is absolutely essential. Successfully achieving a safe, stable, secure, and sustainable space domain will rest on our ability to collectively work together and normalize space operations in the same vein as air, land, and sea. To not do so will invite crippling attacks on space infrastructure that underpins most all of our terrestrial force designs. So in my last few remarks here, I'd like to make an ask of you. If you have a responsibility for your nation's space capabilities, as a service chief, other senior leader, if you haven't already done so, I think it wise to conduct an honest assessment of your current space capabilities. Understand their criticality to operations in the other domains, and then measure their effectiveness against the emerging counterspace threats. Next, collectively determine if you have an appropriate strategy for space integration that informs you and other military and national leadership about where your risks and opportunities lie in this area. It's my contention that none of us can count on space as being available or protect our forces from space-enabled attack if we cannot avoid operational surprise in space, deny first-mover advantage, and conduct responsible counterspace campaigning. Now, that doesn't mean you need to establish your own space force. I'm not wishing that on anybody right now. But you may find that in doing the analysis, you have strengths and weaknesses, where you might gain the best value in placing your resources. Having worked with most of the nations here today firsthand, I know you have space expertise. I know you will benefit greatly by continuing to develop them into a professional space cadre and working deliberately to integrate them into every aspect of military planning and execution. And I also want you to hear directly from me that the U.S. Space Force is ready to assist in that endeavor in any way we can. The U.S. Space Force has made a lot of progress in its first few years, but I know we also have a long way to go. However, let me make something else clear. If push comes to shove and we do come into conflict, I'll tell you that I'm glad to be on this side of the ledger. The U.S. Space Force is a formidable organization, and there are nearly 15,000 Guardians dedicated every single day to enhancing our readiness. And I know that as a part of the global coalition, we will be successful in ensuring a safe, stable, secure, and sustainable space domain. So in closing, I'd like to offer that the conflict in Ukraine has made it clear. Access to and use of space is fundamental to modern warfare. It is also clear that technology is a force enabler that must be supported by integrated training and coalition operations. Historically, space has been an area of unilateral action. This must change. We need to work together as responsible actors to protect and defend against activities that undermine the safety and security of space. We need to improve cooperation, coordination, and opportunities for interoperability. We need to collectively sustain freedom of action in space, optimize our resources, enhance mission assurance and resilience, and most importantly, deter conflict. I'm extremely proud to be a part of this community of like-minded nations, and I very much look forward to continuing to build on our substantial relationships and ensure space operations are effectively integrated into our collective defense. As we say in the United States Space Force, Semper Supra. Thank you very much.